Thank you, Fiona. Our next speaker is, I could run a CV about this long at the moment. Professor Chris Daniels is actually an adjunct professor in biology at the University of South Australia. He's an adjunct professor in zoology at the University of Adelaide. He's currently the presiding member of the Green Adelaide Landscape Board. He's a scientist, he's an author, he's a communicator, but I guess most importantly to us is he's actually a champion for the Kangaroo Island feral cat eradication project and the recreating the nature's ark. So I'd like to invite Chris to come up and actually sum that up a little bit better than I did.
Thank you very much, Bronwyn. And I would like to thank the KI Landscape Board and Nature Foundation for inviting me here and to be part of this incredible moment in time. And I was offered and was incredibly touched and honoured to be offered that role of being a champion for this extraordinary action here. And this will be one of those moments when South Australia will look back in 200 years and go, here's where we stood up. And here's where we made a difference about something that is incredibly important to the biodiversity and to the social and economic situation for a wider community. So I've been asked to talk really about the importance of islands and the possibility for reintroductions. So it's going to take about 3 hours. So have plenty of wine here because it's an enormous task. But the most important thing really to say is why are islands so incredibly important. And it's wonderful to hear from the Commissioner and also from Leon about Kangaroo Island and the importance and focus that this has now in the way we think about conserving biodiversity. It's incredibly important because even though islands are less than 6% of the total landmass on the planet, they have a huge proportion of the number of species. Around 20% of birds, 17% of rodents. It's interesting we selected rodents, all that. Flowering plants, and also a huge percentage of the world's spoken languages, because islands wind up being this refuge for all sorts of cultural and social nuance that tends to disappear upon the mainland. More importantly, they have endemic species, and these species are there in isolation, so have grown apart from perhaps their original species upon the mainland. And they've become something different and something unusual. Sometimes they become completely different species or different genera doing really weird and wonderful things. So on islands, you get giant animals, the giant Galapagos tortoise, for example. You get really small versions, the dwarf emu that you talked about, after whom Ravine de Casors was named. You get dwarf tigers in the Indonesian islands, and you get dwarf hippos and all sorts of dwarf things all around the place there. You also get other really unusual adaptations. Flightlessness starts to occur for birds on islands. So you can think about the famous dodo, of course, and there are flightless cormorants on the Galapagos. All of these unusual physiological changes that create new species. Then you've also got behavioural adaptations that take species from doing one thing into a completely different niche. And maybe this was completely brilliantly demonstrated by Charles Darwin when he looked at his finches from the Galapagos. And here he was able to show that on different islands, or even on the same island, different groups of finch would eat different things. And as a result, their beaks grew to be in different shapes and different sizes and different powers and so forth. So you get behavioural change as well as physiological and anatomical change that created new species. So islands demonstrate evolution. And they demonstrate the forces of change and how we create all of these new ecosystems, these new relationships in places once separated from the rest of the world. So our great laboratories for evolution are there on islands, and Kangaroo Island is no exception, as I'll say in a minute. So you can think about many of the amazing islands and the amazing flora and fauna that they have there and how incredibly important they are to the world contribution to biodiversity. I've listed a few there that I just love. I've spent a lot of my time on islands because they are so interesting. New Zealand, Madagascar, Mauritius, the Caribbean islands, Tasmania, and of course, Kangaroo Island. So there are 6 reasons why we should really be focusing on the islands as our #1 step, if you like, in conserving biodiversity. First 2 I've really already touched on. They're a biodiversity hotspot. So a hotspot is a place which has a disproportionate number of species of plants and animals for their area. And they're often incredibly rich, often because they're protected from predators and disease and parasites. So you get this proliferation of life. They are the home to many of the rare, the unusual, the endemic, as I've already covered there. There are a number of other really important issues about islands. The third is that they are indicators of climate change. Islands are disproportionately hit by the challenges of climate change. Rising sea level is particularly important, and Kangaroo Island is no exception. For most of it is very low lying, so it's at real risk for inundation and for challenge. And therefore, they have become the conservation frontier, if you like, for dealing with climate change challenges. They're rest stops. Islands are incredibly important for so many bird species. We have a lot of migratory birds that pass through or spend time. About 12 species of our migrating birds that come down the East Asian, Australasian flyway will spend time on Kangaroo Island. And they'll spend time there in the summer, fatten up on the wonderful food that Kangaroo Island provides, which we all have enjoyed. And then they'll make their way back to Siberia. But there's, of course, lots of other marine birds that will use the island as rookeries because they're protected areas. And so islands are incredibly important for rookeries. They have an extraordinary coastline. We often forget how important islands are because of how important the support networks they provide to marine animals. And so you have whole masses of marine ecosystems develop along those edges, along those rocky shores. You get coral reefs, you get all of these wonderful spots here. And we have a very large number of mammals and a lot of endemic marine life that spends their time at Kangaroo Island. And of course, we're all well aware of the fish too. That becomes a really important part of both the tourism and the economic life of Kangaroo Island. So what happens on an island also affects what happens in the marine environment. And any change or challenge will lead to high runoffs, pollutions, pesticides, a whole range of other chemicals can do enormous damage to really important parts of our marine life. And this leads to a really important part that we tend to forget when we focus, as I do as a zoologist, on the biodiversity of the island. Islands support people. There's some 600 million people live on islands around the world. I think a large proportion of those are in the UK, but most of the islands have and support really important populations and communities. And those communities are incredible people because they do things differently, because they have special roles. They have learnt and work with the limitations of living on an island. So island communities have to develop sustainable practice. They have to understand how to undertake farming, fisheries, tourism, whole array of different activities, and also support biodiversity, which often underpins a lot of their particular activities. So islands and island communities and the socio-economic fabric of that community is really important when you come to understand and work with conserving biodiversity. And they often set the scene for new and novel ways to do things when it comes to conservation. And that's one of the really exciting reasons for being involved with Kangaroo Island, because the islanders know what they're doing and they do things differently. They embrace a range of technologies and a range of approaches that are incredibly important. So islands are often real-world laboratories in how we can test and understand mechanisms to practice conservation when we come back to the mainland. And it is often the best, the simplest, the most effective way to deliver really good outcomes is to empower the locals because they know what they're doing. There are a whole range of threats to island biodiversity, which unfortunately often mirror the fact that they are biodiversity hotspots, because islands can hold so many species, because often they don't have predators, parasites or disease. They can therefore become home for invasive pests. And we've already heard quite a range of pests that have come on and taken over from Kangaroo Island. You introduce a predator, you've now got a whole mass of species and individuals that are naive to a carnivore. You've also got a whole range of animals that potentially can succumb to disease. So invasive species can wreak havoc on an island in a much greater way than on the mainland, as bad as they are on the mainland. Other threats, of course, on an island is habitat loss. Talked about climate change as causing significant habitat loss through changes in sea level and rainfall patterns, but also clearance and multiple land use does put a lot of the biodiversity under threat. Diseases remain a significant issue. The animals and plants upon the islands have been free of disease and parasites. Introducing vectors such as cats can cause an enormous amount of damage. And Bronwyn has already mentioned about sarcocystis and toxoplasmosis, really nasty little parasites that cats carry that can pass on into sheep, but also pass on to bandicoots and a range of the other native animals there. And so here we have one invasive pest that is actually affecting the social and the economic fabric of the island, as well as affecting the biodiversity. And this is one of the things that islanders can do really well, is that they recognise a shared problem. And by dealing with the cats, you're dealing with a wide range of issues that affect the population. Islands tend to have very small populations of many species. Occasionally with species like colonial birds that are using islands for nesting spots, their numbers might increase to huge numbers, but then they will drop back down again. As a result, if it's a small population size and often a very low level of genetic variability, they are incredibly at risk to predation or to disease. So you wind up with an extraordinary set of challenges there. They're often highly specific and occupy a very narrow niche, and therefore any change to the island can lead to extinction. Climate change, I have already talked about here. There's a nice little one of the toxoplasmosis moving through cats and sarcocystis as well, I think. A little diagram there, and that's what a sheep looks like with these diseases. It's actually really, really awful. As a result, islands have really, really suffered in terms of the extinction crisis. They have become a priority area for integrated conservation efforts, because they have 14 times greater density of critically endangered terrestrial species than the continental areas. So many of our extinct and endangered species are from islands. Some 61% of all species that have gone extinct in the Anthropocene are island species. And if you spend any time in New Zealand, there you will see a country that is in panic about the loss of its biodiversity. As an island, or a series of islands, its species have grown up very much independent of all of these challenges, and now so many of their species are down to literally dozens or under 100 of individuals. And some 37% of all the critically endangered species are confined to islands. So if you want to make a difference, an island is the spot to go. Kangaroo Island is absolutely in this mix for locations that are incredibly challenged. It contains already 25 species of terrestrial mammal, up to 30 species of marine mammals, including all those occasional visitors for whales, 20 reptile species, 8 frogs, 270 species of local fish, predominantly marine fish, over 270 species of birds, including the vagrants and the migrants that come for short periods. There are 17 endemic subspecies of birds, 891 species of native plants, as we've already heard, with another 46 endemic species. And then there's almost uncountable numbers of endemic species of invertebrates. We know so little about the invertebrates. We're just starting to put a focus on them. Another wonderful one, we heard about the assassin spider, but the green carpenter bee is an extraordinary little animal there that lives in the Xanthorrhea. The extinctions have hit there. The dwarf island emu disappeared in the early 1800s, as we've heard. Quolls and brush-tailed phascogales have also gone. And then there's a huge swag of animals that are critically endangered, a large number of plants as well, most famously the kangaroo island dunnart and the glossy back cockatoo, but there's all sorts of others, Bassian thrushes, western whipbirds. The list is depressingly long that are really at threat on Kangaroo Island. The other thing that's happened there, which is an interesting challenge to all of us as biologists, has been introductions. Islands are also regarded as the last hope for so many species. And oddly, really at the beginning of the 19th century, islands became the #1 way to save species becoming rare or endangered or extinct on the mainland. So islands became the home for bettongs and bilbies and introductions all over the place, particularly in South Australia, very popular in Western Australia and Victoria as well. Many of these introductions were done without an understanding of genetics and therefore inbreeding, without an understanding of how many should be introduced, and an understanding of the impact on the local environment. Kangaroo Island was traditionally regarded as a really important ark, with some 32 species tried between 1929 and 1970. Only 2 reptiles established. I think it was the blue tongue and one of the tortoises, long-necked tortoise. 16 birds were tried, 4 of which are now established. 6 additional bird species have made their own way to the island. And 8 mammals were introduced, 3 of which have thrived. So abundant species now include Cape Barren geese, kookaburras, Australian brush turkeys, koalas and platypus. And then of course a whole swag of others were introduced, which have turned out to be pests. As we heard, the rabbits were introduced in the 1880s. Someone did try foxes, would you believe it, in the 1880s as well, but fortunately they didn't take. And then of course goats, pigs and deer, we have won that battle, thank goodness, which leaves one really nasty pest left. So we're down to an island with one, and it is incredibly rare to be in this situation. And if we can deal with cats, then the island has a great hope for its own sake, for the social and economic fabric of the community, and as a potential space for other reintroductions into the future. The solution to this challenge is actually to take a multidisciplinary, multifactorial approach to conservation. So traditional conservation methods have usually involved finding remnant vegetation and putting a fence around it. And that's incredibly important. And it's wonderful to have that target of 30% for remnant vegetation within Australia. Ideally, it'd be nice to be 40 to 45%. Just putting it out there. That's incredibly important because that's always the best hope for retaining the broad range of species, but more importantly, the broad range of ecosystems. And there is so much more that we can do. So much of this is about pest, plant and animal management, about thinking about rewilding and translocations for species, because in many places, there just aren't the animals left anymore. And New Zealand is practicing this as a really good example. It is about connecting diverse and separate populations and regions so that animals can transfer from one spot to another. It is about revegetation and restoration. And there's amazing programs in re-veg and restoration on the island and elsewhere. It's about practicing genetic rescue, which means really understanding the genetic basis for a population. And if they are becoming inbred, then that becomes a challenge. And how do we deal with that? Because we don't want genetic disease to start to appear in really important populations. It's about living with species in our backyards, in our houses, in our communities, treating disease and managing parasites, citizen science and engaging the local community, managing populations. This is a really difficult set of discussions often to have with communities about how a really important population would need to be managed and then managed in the context of climate change. What you hear from James is the island is doing almost all of those, if not all of those. So it's this integrated approach. The one I didn't really mention is cutting edge technology. And when you bring that into it as well, that has the best chance of success. So seeing how a community embrace a really wide range of approaches is incredibly exciting. Therefore, conservation on islands works. We have had some enormous successes on islands. And again, New Zealand is probably the best example. They've had some successes in recovery of the Galapagos and they've had some losses. There are still many islands for which there's great worry, Madagascar being one of them. But when we put this effort into an island, we can make it a difference and can make it work. And it's got proven management actions that benefit both the local people and their community and the species diversity on the island. So there's no better opportunity to make a real difference and have this case study, this paradigm for how a community can live with biodiversity for the benefit of everyone. Thank you very much.